My name is Steve Iriki. I'm an instructor of business at Western. Among other things, one of the classes I teach is business ethics. And I was asked by Stacy today to talk about Elizabeth Holmes and business ethics. As you know, she was the founder of Theranos. This is their actual former headquarters in Silicon Valley, located in California. Of course, that's a picture of Elizabeth with a blood sample, a few drops of blood. So, what I want to first talk about is why business ethics is important, why we care about it, why in the business program we study about it. First of all, let's talk about unethical business practices. What can be the impact of having an unethical business? Well, there's several impacts. First of all, it can cause you legal problems, right? Businesses and their employees that act unethically in ways that break the law can face criminal sentences, fines, and other penalties. Elizabeth is learning about that firsthand right now. But you see, especially the last 20 years, a lot of unethical leaders of businesses have been charged and some have been convicted criminally. You just look at the leaders of Enron, of MCI WorldCom, et cetera, et cetera. The other impact of having an unethical business is it can lead to poor employee performance. When you think about that, that's just common sense, right? If you're working for a sleazy, unethical company and you're an employee there, you're not going to be very motivated to work hard for that company. You're not going to feel good about working there. You're not going to be loyal and want to stay there for years and years, right? That's a negative influence, a negative impact on you, right? The third issue about having an unethical business is that business will have a poor reputation after a while. Word will get around. That company will get unflattering publicity, et cetera, et cetera. It's really going to impact that business. And fourth, and very importantly, it's going to affect that business's bottom line. It's going to affect its revenue, its profits. You can just look and see what happened with Theranos. You can look and see what happened with other companies, especially something like Enron. With Enron, for example, that company filed for bankruptcy and went out of business. It was one of the fastest growing, most successful public companies. And just a few years after all these public disclosures came about its accounting fraud and whatnot, it went out of business. Let's look at the flip side. If you run a very ethical company, there are going to be certain business positive impacts from that, right? First of all, you're going to motivate and inspire your employees. You guys are going to feel good. If you work for a company that acts very ethically, that feels very strongly about certain things, about its employees, about its customers, about the community it does business in, you're going to feel good about working for that company, right? You're going to work hard for that company. You're going to be motivated. You're going to be loyal for that company, right? Those are all natural consequences from working for an ethical company. The other thing that's going to happen is that firm is going to establish a good reputation. It's going to have a good PR. It's going to help that company. Third thing is the stakeholders connected with that company. What I mean by stakeholders are people who have some interest or claim in that company. The employees, the customers, the vendors, the community where that company does business. They're all stakeholders. They're all interested in what that company does. Those stakeholders are going to be happy. They're going to be satisfied. You're going to be able to attract new customers. And finally, and most importantly, it's going to enhance that company's revenue. It's going to enhance its profits. It's going to help its bottom line. When you think of companies with good reputations who are successful, think of companies like Starbucks, right? Starbucks was founded and led by Howard Schultz, who was a very ethical man who strived hard in establishing that company's good reputation. And it helped Starbucks and its bottom line immensely. All right, let's talk about Elizabeth Holmes. She was born in February of 1984. Her father is Christian Holmes. Her mother is Noelle Ann. Here is a photo of Elizabeth's father. What's kind of interesting is that Elizabeth's father was a vice president at Enron, which is an infamous company. I can't find any evidence that Elizabeth's father was involved in any of the accounting misdeeds or fraud that occurred in Enron. He just, by coincidence, happened to be there. After he left Enron, he held various positions with various government agencies. For example, he worked for USAID, which is a government agency. Elizabeth grew up in Washington, D.C. and in the Houston area. By all indications, she was a very determined child. She was very, very competitive. As an example, one of her favorite games was Monopoly, and I'm sure you're all familiar with Monopoly. When you're playing Monopoly, at a certain point, it becomes pretty obvious that one player is going to win, right? One player has most of the money, most of the properties. Elizabeth, when she played Monopoly and she was winning, she insisted on playing the game to the very end. All right? Most of the time, when it's obvious someone's going to win, you just say, oh, Betty or Charlie's going to win, let's stop, right? Not Elizabeth. If she was winning, she insisted that all the players play until she had all the money and all the properties. That's just the kind of competitive person that she was. All right. Elizabeth was a very bright, very talented person. She was admitted to Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. There's a photo of Stanford there. She began her studies in 2002, and her major was chemical engineering. What's interesting is after her first year, that summer, she worked in a laboratory and tested for severe acute respiratory syndrome. And that test was done by collecting blood samples with syringes. And Elizabeth early on got exposure to testing and use of syringes and handling blood, and she didn't like it. She thought it was very messy and archaic, and it got her thinking there has to be a better way to get somebody's test results and collect samples. Collecting things through a syringe is just medieval, she thought. So while at Stanford, she came up with the idea of creating blood tests that would require only a few drops of blood. One of her teachers, who's pictured here, Phyllis Gardner, who's a professor of clinical pharmacology at Stanford, told Elizabeth that her idea wasn't feasible. Current technology just did not allow it. You couldn't get reliable test results from just a few drops of blood. You needed much more blood. But Elizabeth didn't listen. So what Elizabeth did is she founded the company Real-Time Cures. She later renamed it Theranos, which is a combination of therapy and diagnosis. She left Stanford in 2003, and she used her tuition money to help fund Theranos. Elizabeth and Theranos started raising money. They targeted wealthy investors and venture capitalists. Holmes was personally involved in this fundraising. Turns out she was really good at it. Elizabeth, as you probably know, was a great admirer of the late Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, and she adopted his black turtleneck look, which she wore all the time. All right, there's two quotes here. One of them you're probably familiar with by Thomas Tusser, "Fool and his money are soon parted." Then there's a second quote by Elizabeth's former professor, who you saw earlier. And she says, "Old men, the brains go to their groin." All right, and this becomes relevant, as you'll soon see. All right, by December of 2004, just after a year she started Theranos, Elizabeth had raised $6 million to fund the new company, which is pretty impressive. However, just a few years later, by the end of 2010, Elizabeth and Theranos had raised $92 million in venture capital. In 2014, just 10 years later, Holmes was named one of America's richest women by Forbes magazine. At that point, Theranos was valued at $9 billion. All right, so it looks like she was going to be very rich and very wealthy and very successful. This is a sample of the board of directors of Theranos. Now, I've looked at boards of public companies before, but I've never seen a board like this. I've never seen such a high-powered board. Just look at this board. It consisted of people like Henry Kissinger, who's former Secretary of State, George Shultz, another former Secretary of State, James Mattis, he's former Secretary of Defense under Donald Trump, Sam Nunn, former U.S. Senator from Georgia, Richard Kovacevic, who's the former CEO of Wells Fargo, David Boies, who's a very famous attorney, Riley Bechtel, who's a former CEO of Bechtel Corporation, which is one of the largest engineering firms in the world, and William Perry, who's a former Secretary of Defense. Now, just look at this board, this sample of the board. What strikes you about this board? Anyone? Yes? There's no diversity. It's all old white men, isn't it? All right? There's no women on the board. There's no minorities, people of color on the board. Furthermore, most of them are former government officials, right? You don't see anyone with any medical background. You don't see anybody with any background in like medical testing or lab work. You don't see anybody with like a hard science background. It's all old white men, right? Now, Elizabeth was personally involved in recruiting the board for Theranos. She handpicked this board. And I think what happened is Elizabeth is a very smart, clever person. She picked a board that she knew she could control and manipulate. She picked a board of old white men who she knew she could charm and who would spend most of her time just kind of oogling her, right? Remember that quote by Professor Gardner? That's what Professor Gardner was referring to, right? Elizabeth picked a board who would just spend time staring at her during board meetings, right? They wouldn't ask her tough questions. So, this is the board, a sample of the board of Theranos, right? So here's what happens. Theranos came up with a prototype testing machine, which it claimed would conduct hundreds of different tests using only a few drops of blood. Here's the machine. She nicknamed it Edison, after Thomas Edison. Turns out in reality, the machine could only perform a limited number of tests with varying degrees of accuracy. For example, one of the things that Theranos would do is if they were giving a tour of the company to a potential new investor, they'd show the investor the machine. Then they'd take a blood sample, a small blood sample from the investor. And then they would say, okay, let's continue the tour, and they'd show him or her other parts of the corporate headquarters, right? Then they would come back and they'd have test results from that person's blood sample, right? And they'd have like 20, 30, 40 different tests. The implication being they used the Edison machine to get those test results. In actuality, what they would do is they'd take that person's blood sample, and they had conventional machines also in the lab. They'd run that blood sample through the conventional machines. They wouldn't use the Edison machine. All right? The reason being is the Edison machine could only run a few results, and those results were unreliable. Okay? So what happened? Well, in October of 2015, a well-known Wall Street Journal reporter, John Carreyrou, published an investigation in the Wall Street Journal where he found that Theranos' technology did not work as claimed, and that most of the test results came from using traditional third-party machines. All right? Up until this time, everyone was excited about Theranos and its technology. It was groundbreaking, because if you saw the machine, see how small it is? Conventional blood testing machines are much bigger. Furthermore, you can't easily move them around. The Theranos Edison machine, they said it was going to be mobile. They could move it around. You could set up a blood testing station, you know, in like an RV or outside or any place where you had access to the internet and electricity. It was going to be groundbreaking, the things that you could do with this machine. But all turned out not to be true. Okay? And John Carreyrou brought this to light. So what happened as a result? Well, first of all, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and the FDA began to conduct an investigation of Theranos. In July of 2016, the Centers for Medicare banned Elizabeth Holmes from the lab testing industry for 2 years. In late 2016, just a year after the story came out, the company had to shut its clinical labs and laid off 340 employees. And just a couple years later, the company closed its doors entirely. And remember, at its height, the company had more than 800 employees working at the firm. So the company, the firm, closed its doors. It no longer exists. So, what was the fallout for Elizabeth? Well, first of all, she was the target of several lawsuits by former investors, business partners, and patients. Investors invested close to $1 trillion in the company. I mean, not $1 trillion, $1 billion in the company. In March of 2018, Holmes settled with the Security Exchange Commission and agreed not to hold an officer position with a public company for 10 years. And finally, and most importantly, in June of 2018, Elizabeth was indicted for fraud in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California in San Jose. San Jose is in Silicon Valley, where Theranos was located. Here's a copy of the face page of the indictment. It's kind of hard to see, but you can see it's against Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani. You guys probably know Sunny was Elizabeth's former lover. He was also the chief operating officer at Theranos. He was the number 2 person at the company. She has been indicted for wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. And these charges are brought against her again in federal court. So, here's a copy of page 9 of the indictment. It's a little hard to see, but what these are some of the wire fraud charges against Elizabeth. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 charges right here, and they involve money that was wired by certain investors to Theranos' bank account. And you can see the amount of money wired ranges from $100,000 up to $100 million. Just for your information, wire fraud is a federal crime. What wire fraud is if you defraud somebody, and you defraud them by using the telephone, telegraph, email, some kind of electronic transmission, that constitutes wire fraud. And that's what Elizabeth and Sonny did. All right? They, as part of their fraud, they probably emailed people, telephoned people, called people on their cell phones. That constitutes wire fraud. All right. As you probably know, trial against Elizabeth in the criminal case began at the end of August. Case is being tried before Judge Davia. He's pictured here. He's a U.S. District Court judge, so he's a federal judge. She's being tried in the San Jose Federal Courthouse, which is pictured here. She has, at this point, it looks like, a few defenses. First of all, Elizabeth is blaming her co-defendant, Sonny Balwani. She's also arguing that basically failure of a business like Theranos doesn't in and of itself constitute a crime. And then there's a third defense which we expect her to raise. Basically, she's going to claim that she was either physically or psychologically abused, probably by Sonny, and that she was kind of forced to take part in these crimes. She's going to, or is expected to, call an expert witness who's going to testify to this effect. The government made a motion, which was granted by the judge, to have her examined by their own expert witness as to her psychological state. So, they will also call their own expert witness along these lines. So that's going to be her defenses. All right. Just a few highlights of some of the evidence so far. The former controller of Theranos testified that while the company was losing hundreds of millions of dollars, Holmes exaggerated financial projections about the company to investors. Another highlight is that a former Theranos lab associate has testified that the accuracy of the lab results from the Edison machine was like flipping a coin. There was another witness, a customer that has just testified recently, who indicated that she took a Theranos lab test because at the time she was pregnant, and the test results showed that it was likely she was going to have a miscarriage or was about to have a miscarriage. Turned out those lab results were completely wrong. She didn't have a miscarriage. Matter of fact, she carried her baby to term and had a baby several months later. So that's some of the testimony so far. Now, let's talk about what are the possible consequences for Elizabeth. In federal court, judges use a set of guidelines as an aid in determining a convicted defendant's sentence. So Elizabeth, if she's sentenced, the judge will use this, what's called sentencing table. This is part of what's known as the federal sentencing guidelines. These are guidelines for federal judges in criminal cases. Here's how this sentencing table works. You notice on the left, there's something called an offense level. The more serious a crime you're convicted of, the higher the offense level. They go from 1 up to, it's hard to read, I think it's 43. And then here, on this horizontal part of the table, you see it says criminal history. If you have one or more felony convictions, previous felony convictions, your criminal history goes up from 1 up to 6. In Elizabeth's case, she has no prior felony convictions, right? It's the first time she's been in trouble. So her criminal history category is 1. So question is what consequences is Elizabeth facing if she's convicted? Well, the way federal crimes work is the more money you steal, the higher your offense level, right? And since Elizabeth is accused of stealing millions upon millions of dollars, she could face a very high offense level. I estimate the offense level she could face is between 36 and 40, all right, which is almost near the bottom here. So what does that mean? Well, given her criminal history category of 1, it means she could face a sentence in here. What does this mean? It's a little hard to read, so I blew it up here. Elizabeth could face a sentence of between 188 to 365 months in jail if she's convicted. So what is that? 15 to 30 years in jail, potentially, if she's convicted. Now, one thing I should mention, this is if she's convicted. I think the case against her is pretty good, but we'll wait and see what happens. The trial is supposed to continue for another about 2 months or so, so we won't have a sentence anytime soon, but we'll see what happens. But she could face up to 30 years in prison. So, let's move on. What does Elizabeth's case and her situation teach us about business ethics? Well, first of all, lesson 1 is ethics starts with an organization's leadership. That really isn't too surprising, right? The firm's leaders are role models for the entire organization. They set the tone and lead by example, right? To the left is Howard Schultz, who is a very ethical leader who founded and ran Starbucks. On the right is Bernie Madoff, who's an infamous investment banker who defrauded people of billions of dollars. So this is a stark contrast of 2 different types of leaders and different organizations that they led. Starbucks is a very ethical company who cares about its employees and its suppliers. They try to look after their stakeholders. In contrast, Bernie Madoff ran a very corrupt and unethical business. And his employees followed after him. They participated in his fraud. All right, lesson 2. Other parts of the organization help influence the firm's conduct and should not abdicate their responsibilities. This is a schematic of how a corporation, your typical corporation, is set up. This is Elizabeth. She was the CEO, Chief Executive Officer of Theranos. Above her, she reported to the board of directors. The board of directors of a corporation hire and fire the CEO. They are the CEO's bosses. In this case, that board I showed you earlier, that impressive, powerful board, completely abdicated their duty. They didn't watch or check Elizabeth at all. In a typical public company, what the board of directors will do is they will closely oversee what senior management is doing, right? They will look into the company's finances. They will look at the company's performance. They will look at the company's products and make sure that the company's well run and that the CEO is doing what he or she is saying they're doing. In the case of Theranos, they didn't do that. They didn't look into the company's finances. They didn't look into their performance. They didn't look at the Edison machine. They completely trusted Elizabeth and what she was doing. Professor Gardner, in her earlier quote, was absolutely right. Right? The board completely abdicated their duty, and that's why Elizabeth was able to do the things she was doing, right? Lesson 3. There are certain steps you should take to foster an ethical organization. First of all, the leaders need to express their expectations. They should express them in a mission statement or code of conduct for the company. They should outline what is acceptable and what is not. Next, the company should have ethics training provided to all employees. The employees need to understand what is acceptable and what is not, and how to deal with ethical dilemmas, ethical situations. Third, those that violate the company's standards need to be punished, right? You can't tolerate unethical behavior. You need to punish it. Now, in the case of Theranos, they did have a mission statement, but that mission statement didn't refer to any ethical obligations or duties, and the firm had no code of conduct whatsoever. So, the mission statement and the code of conduct provide a framework and guidance for employees on what they should do in ethical situations. Theranos didn't have any such framework. All right. Fourth, the other lesson that Theranos and Elizabeth teaches us is that a firm needs to set up appropriate reporting mechanisms. What do I mean by that? First of all, they have to provide protective mechanisms whereby employees can get confidential information or advice, right? They should be able to contact somebody in the firm, an ethics officer or something like that, saying, I'm faced with this situation, what should I do? Right? They need to be able to turn to some expert to get advice to help them. Next, larger organizations should have an ethics hotline that you can call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, if you're faced with an ethical situation. And most larger public companies do have an ethics hotline. Theranos did not. All right? As I said, Theranos had no ethics hotline and they had no reporting mechanism. So when employees were faced with ethical issues, they had no one to turn to. All right. Last important lesson, and this is important. When you're evaluating your employees, one of the things you should evaluate them on is their ethical conduct. Are they following the firm's code of conduct and mission statement when it comes to ethics? If they are, you should reward them. If not, you should punish them. This is important. This, among other things, reinforces that ethics is important to the organization and that certain behavior is acceptable and other behavior is not. All right, questions about Elizabeth, about her trial, anything else? Questions? Yes?
I know you were talking about the third part of the defense where you said that she might try to say that she was kind of forced into doing this stuff. How likely do you think that would be to her benefit?
I think it's going to be hard to prove. I mean, if you've seen interviews of Elizabeth, she's a very confident person. She's very self-assured. She's in control. She knows what she's doing. It's a little hard to believe that someone else forced her to do this. For that defense to have a good chance to succeed, she's going to have some good witnesses who come forward and say, yeah, during this period, it was a bad period for Elizabeth. She was vulnerable. She was bullied. She felt she had no choice but to do this. They're going to have to find some witnesses to that effect. Just having an expert who said, yes, I've examined Elizabeth and I find evidence of ABC. The problem with just coming up with one expert that says that is the government's going to come up with an expert with an impressive list of credentials, and he or she is going to say, yes, I've examined Elizabeth, and she's perfectly fine, right? And then who's the jury to believe, right? It's going to be hard. Yes, George.
I'll ask a question on, and I'd like you to comment on how this is perhaps an example of why more efficient government regulation is necessary, because this company defrauded, as Enron did, huge numbers of investors, as well as their own employees. And you had people losing their life savings in some cases, you had people losing their jobs and ability to support their families. And the board of directors, while they look reputable, will claim, oh, I didn't know what was going on, as if it was my job to know what was going on. They got paid to be on their board of directors, but not one of them will suffer financial results. And the controller of the company became a government witness against the company on the state side. And I'm sure they did that only because they were granted immunity from prosecution themselves. But the controller of that organization, who knows exactly financially what's going on in the organization and controls it, should be one of the primary people that faces jail terms and financial responsibility, which are often two very different things.
Right. That's a very good point. There has been some additional regulation as a result of Enron and MCI WorldCom. I think it was in 2002, Sarbanes-Oxley was passed, and Sarbanes-Oxley, or SOX, S-O-X for short, was actually in effect at this time. But obviously it wasn't strong enough to prevent this conduct. So there is some increased regulation. Sarbanes-Oxley was a federal law that was passed that increased accounting oversight, accounting regulations, because of the fraud that happened at Enron and similar corporations. But as you can see with Theranos, it wasn't enough. Under Sarbanes-Oxley, for example, the CEO and CFO of the company are supposed to sign off on the company's financial records, and if those financial records prove to be incorrect or false, they face criminal liability. Now, one limitation of Sarbanes-Oxley is it only applies to public companies. Theranos never went public. They were a private company. They had a lot of investors. They eventually hoped to go public, but they didn't. The John Carreyrou story came to light before they went public. So Sarbanes-Oxley didn't apply to them. But George raises a good point. Obviously, this was a massive fraud where investors were defrauded of hundreds of millions of dollars. And the question arises is, do we need more government regulation for this? Do we need stronger criminal laws for this, right? Because obviously the investors weren't protected. And at this point, no legislation has been introduced because of the fallout of Theranos. But it's something that people should consider. I mean, it's kind of, I guess the best advice is, you know, if something sounds too good to be true, then you should think twice about investing in it, right? Yes, Bryson.
She only be convicted of wire fraud if she was like tampering with like the health of patients and whatnot. Like I feel like is it just because wire fraud just overshadowed everything?
There's two parts of the federal case against her. There's the fraud, the financial fraud, where she defrauded investors. There was part of the case where the government alleged she was guilty of fraud because she gave patients inaccurate or incorrect test results. There were some charges along those lines, but early in the case, the judge dismissed those charges. He felt that since there wasn't any proof of any financial harm, that didn't constitute fraud. Fraud is where you make some important misrepresentation or key omission to somebody, and you suffer monetary damages as a result, right? You write me a check for $10,000, something like that. You sign over a deed to your house, something like that, and you suffer monetary damages. The judge felt that since there was no monetary damages, he dismissed that part of the case. So basically, the remaining allegations against Elizabeth are financial fraud allegations. Now, she easily could be sued in civil court by those patients, and they could allege damages, emotional distress, whatnot, and she could be sued there. But at this point, she's not charged criminally for that conduct, which isn't to say that it's not heinous, but it's not financial fraud.
Well, there was like a case where a woman was told that she wasn't producing enough estrogen or something along those lines, so she was prescribed a medication that was, aid her with that, and at that point, it was either the low levels of estrogen or excessive levels of estrogen could prove that she had a tumor somewhere in her body, but that wasn't true because she had inconsistent results.
Right.
So,
You might be able to charge her criminally with that, maybe. I think the reason they went with mostly financial fraud is they thought it would be easier and cleaner to prove that. All right? Questions? George.
Let me ask one other question then, since it doesn't seem to be much coming. A question that is now becoming more apparent in federal law is personal responsibility as opposed to corporate responsibility and liability.
Right.
Often, people that manage these companies made huge fortunes for themselves and then claimed that, well, the corporation did this, not me personally, so I'm not personally responsible for the results of that fraud or that crime. And they've gotten away with it almost universally. Her father, who had been with Enron, vice president of Enron, and the other executives of Enron, had the company go into bankruptcy, and its assets, which were virtually nothing, were supposed to compensate those that were defrauded. But they lost no personal property in the settlements of that. When the president of Enron died, before he went to jail or right soon after, his widow had to pay back nothing of the outstanding fortune that they had made from those defraudings of the public, the people of California, by the Enron Corporation. So there is a question that should be addressed, because the Supreme Court has recently said that corporations are people. Now, they did that in a case in which it talked about companies giving campaign contributions to their chosen political officers that they buy off with campaign contributions, not bribes. Semantics. But the thing is, if corporations have been said by the Supreme Court to be people, then should not people be liable for the actions of those corporations? And the financial benefits that they have gained should be put in the scale.
Well, I'll say this. There are corporate officers who they and their companies defrauded people, and sometimes, I emphasize the word sometimes, they are tried. Elizabeth and Sonny are good examples. There are many times when they're not. There are other instances where only maybe the top 1 or 2 people are charged, and many of the other people who helped or cooperated aren't charged, or they're given light sentences. So I think this dovetails with kind of a larger question about the United States and its economy. The United States is built on capitalism. It is by and large a free market economy with not as much government regulation as some other countries, let's say compared to Europe. So you run into a question. In a free market economy with capitalism, a lot of times what economists expect is that it's the consumer who's going to punish those individuals in those companies, right? If they think a company is not doing business fairly, doesn't have good reputation, then consumers will just say, you know what, we're not going to deal with that company anymore, we're not going to deal with them, they're going to go out of business, those business people are going to lose their shirts, et cetera, et cetera. It's the market that's going to punish them. But, you know, when you have egregious conduct like this, question is do you need to go further? Do you need additional steps? Do you need the government to step in with greater regulation, with greater punishments? Well, I think that's a bigger public policy question. I don't think there's a right answer, per se. But, no, you bring up a good point. I think in other countries, Elizabeth and the people at Theranos would be facing much greater peril, right? For example, I think in China, she would have been tried by now and probably executed. I'm serious. They don't stand for widespread financial fraud. And once they uncover it, they punish it swiftly. Other questions?
You said when they were tried, they were still considered a private company. How would the scenario be different if they did have any public offering, they were tried as a public company?
They could have been charged under, then Sarbanes-Oxley would have applied to them. And Sarbanes-Oxley, one of the requirements is every year a public company has to issue financial statements, right? And when they issue financial statements, both the CEO and the chief financial officer have to attest to them. They have to sign off to say, as far as we know, these things are accurate. And if they don't prove to be accurate or they're fraudulent, they're open to criminal penalties. So she could have been charged with violating Sarbanes-Oxley, which I think would have been a pretty simple case. Either the financials are accurate or they're not, and she could have been punished under that. Right?
One more question, Steve, and then we need to get the QR code out.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I was going to ask, do we see what the QR code looks like?
Sure.
Thank you.
Quite the question.
All right. There's the QR code.